Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Dinara and Natasha for inviting me to this conference. I'm so sorry that my Russian is very poor, so I will have to speak in English. But today I'm very excited to present my research on visual reconstructions of Java woman, also known as Pithecanthropus erectus, which has since been reclassified as Homo erectus. And my presentation is going to take you through a kind of timeline of the reconstructions over the centuries of this fossil specimen, which was originally discovered to be the missing link between apes and humans. And through my discussion, we will see how all sorts of socio-political, racial, and especially colonial notions of race, evolution, and social hierarchies infused itself to these so-called scientific representations. And I will also be discussing Mikhail Gerasimov's work, who is, of course, a very noted Russian paleoanthropologist and reconstruction artist. So first, before we get into any reconstructions, I want to show you what the original fossils looks like. So we see here the fossils, it comprises of three small pieces, essentially. So Java man was discovered in two parts at Trinil, which was the Dutch East Indies at the time, but is now Indonesia in central Java. So in September of 1891, a molar, as you can see on the bottom left, was discovered. And in October later that year, a skull cap on the top right was discovered near the molar. And then nearly a year later, in August 1892, a femur in the middle was discovered in the same sedimentary layer. So the person who discovered and initiated this discovery was Dutch anatomist Eugène Dubois, who had been very influenced by notions that the missing link that would show human evolution from apes could be found in Indonesia or somewhere therein, especially from a lost continent which had been postulated at the time called Lemuria. So using his colonial networks, Dubois embarked on an extensive search of this region, which was heavily prone to flooding, landslides, and was covered in all sorts of paleontological fossils and of animals, and of course of other Homo erectuses, which were later discovered. So while Dubois did not discover the fossils himself, his engineers did, he determined this was definitely part of the same specimen and dubbed it Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. It has since been recategorized in 1950, however, as Homo erectus. However, Dubois was confident not only were the fossils part of one specimen, but rather it represented a new species. But when he shared his discovery in Europe, he was met with a lot of criticism and skepticism, because not only did they believe that it was not part of the same specimen, since Dubois did not record the sedimentary layers that he excavated, but that this was not actually a new species. It was perhaps part ape or human, or perhaps a lower race of human, as Europeans believed at the time. Now, why am I discussing this fossil specifically? Not only does it play a crucial role in the history of paleoanthropology, but rather I believe that looking at visual reconstructions of Java man really shows us how diverse and non-objective, really, many visual reconstructions of paleoanthropology tends to be. While we believe often that these paleoanthropological displays in museums, for example, are literally based on the fossil evidence itself, my research shows that this actually was an amalgamation of Western European and Americans' notions of social Darwinism, which included race sciences, and really incorporated their fears, the intentions of the curators to disseminate this information the clearest way possible, but also to show the hierarchy of man in developing to become the kind of Anglo-Saxon human. So the first, so my argument essentially is because of the scant fossil evidence discovered, Java man essentially provided a convenient blank canvas as well, onto which notions of the missing link can be explored and contested. So my work also is built upon the works of other scholars who have looked into Neanderthals especially, but not much work has been done on reconstructions of Homo erectus. So the first examples I want to show you, since this is a Russian conference and I want to pay homage to Mikhail Gerasimov, are reconstructions from Russia, one of which is Gerasimov and the other one is anonymous. So I would really love if anyone could help me identify who the maker was, whether this still exists, perhaps in the archives, and more information about this exhibit, because I couldn't find anything, any of the sources in English. So a little bit of background on Mikhail Mikhailovich Gerasimov. As many of you, I'm sure, know, he was considered to be the father of the technique of facial reconstructions, and he developed what was called the Russian model in 1924. He was considered really one of the first, if not the first, paleoanthropologist to accurately represent facial reconstructions based on a scientific method that he recorded, and not just by a kind of artistic imagination. So what differed between the Russian school and the American school, which I will be talking about as well later, is that Gerasimov did not base his reconstructions off soft tissue measurements. So he based it on the kind of musculature of the face and the skull, which is different from the American school, which based it very much on soft tissue depth. And he was known to have created many, as much as 200 reconstructions of prehistoric hominids. On the bottom right here, we see his reconstruction of Homo erectus from the mid-20th century. I'm not exactly sure. It just says that was from the mid-20th century. It's currently at the GIM Museum. And it was probably reconstructed, I would say, after Pithecanthropus was reclassified as Homo erectus. That's why it's called Homo erectus. But on the left here is actually an excellent historical archive of the period of time when Pithecanthropus was very much in the public knowledge, the star of paleoanthropological discovery. This display from an exhibition in what was then Leningrad, in the Kunstkamera, of Pithecanthropus, and we see the map of Java where it was discovered, a plaster cast of the fossil, and the kind of reconstruction that the artist made. And so why did I start with this, really? It's because while many have said that Gerasimov was the first to do a kind of forensic reconstruction based on the fossil evidence, what does this mean for reconstructions that were presented before and after? Do we see a kind of marked difference before and after this kind of very scientific, objective reconstruction method? Or do we see the kind of biases carried on from the past? And in my explanations, I will be focusing on the US and on Western Europe. My research very much covers the kind of decolonization of epistemologies of science that have included the kind of colonial racial thinking that have permeated through it, especially in Indonesia. So the first reconstruction I want to show you actually predates the fossil evidence and shows just how much imagination kind of goes into these reconstructions, and then are carried through in future reconstructions, even with more fossil evidence and with more scientific techniques. On the right here, we see Henri Duclouzio's figure, which L'homme primitif, and we see this is based on German scientist Ernst Haeckel's theory of what Pithecanthropus might have looked like. And it appears to be a mix of racist, social Darwinistic, physiognomic studies of Africans. We see the very exaggerated facial figures, the very dark skin, the hairy body, the kind of exaggerated skull features. And it was also a mix with the visual motif of the wild man of the forest, which is commonly seen in Renaissance and medieval art, where an artist would show, as we see on the left here, depict these kinds of imaginary primitive men who lived on the outskirts of town and appear almost entirely bestial and live in a kind of animalistic way, but still is recognizably human. And on the right here, I also want to show you the kind of common physiognomic studies of social Darwinism, a really racial pseudoscience that permeated Western Europe and the United States at this time, that led to movements such as the eugenics movement, and really influenced people to think that certain races of man were less evolved than others. We see here a direct correlation between young chimpanzee to a Negro to then a Greek Caucasian white man, which they believed at the time. And on the left here, we see a drastically different reconstruction imagined by Gabriel von Max. Again, this was a gift for Ernst Haeckel, who postulated the topic of the notion of Pithecanthropus. And we see here a kind of very Victorian English family portrait. It's almost uncanny. We have no fossil evidence. However, the artist has took such liberties as to show it in a kind of nuclear heteronormative family structure. We see the female Pithecanthropus on the ground, suckling a baby, while the male looks over her protectively. And we see there a combination of kind of an imaginary bestial half man, half human, but upright. We see these are two very different images, but these images, despite predating the fossil evidence, continue to be reproduced by later artists. So the first reconstruction that was technically based on the fossil evidence was by Eugene Dubois himself, and he created this life-size sculpture for the 1900 World's Fair, and it was made of plaster of Paris, wood, and metal. Now, I want you to take a look at this very strange, uncanny figure for a second and see that his proportions appear to be, quite strange. It doesn't really gel together. But and this is because he really wanted to convince people that, in fact, a species that combine ape-like features of the head, kind of protruding forehead, jaw, large cranial mass, could be human-like as well, could stand upright, as well as use tools, quite sophisticated, but still be able to climb trees with dexterity. So you see the kind of finger-like toes, the very long toes on his feet. But instead of basing this off of the fossil records, of which there was very little of, only 3 pieces, he essentially based this, according to his writing, on, quote, inferior human races, since he believed they were closer in evolution to apes and monkeys. He also added the deer antler based on his understanding of what inferior prehistoric Homo sapien cultures were like. So he took inspiration from the kind of tribal societies that were extant at the time, who he believed were closer in evolution to apes. And actually, instead of being a reconstruction from the fossils, this was allegedly modeled on his 11-year-old son, Pete. So moving on now to the first publicly available reconstruction of Java Man, which really puts it in the spotlight in terms of public education. And let's keep in mind that at this time, which was the early 20th century, acceptance of the kind of missing link, the evolutionary theory, was still hotly contested. Even though Darwin had long since published his theories of evolution, a lot of conservative elements in society, especially religious elements, still rejected the notion that apes and humans shared a kind of common ancestor. So one of the first reconstructions available to the public to really teach the public about this was by Belgian museum curator Aimé Routot and artist Louis Mascret. So the figure was based on the gibbon, since they thought it was the closest linked to humans. And we see this is quite perhaps the most bestial reconstruction of Pithecanthropus. We see he looks almost exactly like a gibbon. He's covered in a kind of lush Edenic vegetation. He's looking up wistfully, and Routot had specifically instructed Mascret to base the reconstruction off of the fossils, but posed in what he said was characteristic actions. So that's why it looks like he's perhaps about to climb a tree, or is lost in the forest somewhere. And actually, these reconstructions were not necessarily based on the fossil evidence, because we know that Routot, the curator, really used these reconstructions of different prehistoric hominids to develop his theory of an Eolithic culture, which was widely disproved even at the time, whence humans used stone tools, which he called eoliths. And we see here Pithecanthropus is holding a stone tool himself. We had no evidence that this was the case, but he really wanted to show that this was a kind of ongoing trend that early hominids were using stone tools. And they even said that the figure is shown to be about to climb a tree, quote, in the way of Tasmanians. So we see again this kind of conflation of prehistoric hominids with extant tribal cultures who they consider closer in evolution. And despite claims of scientific veracity, the pair openly changed and adapted their popular sculptures when ordered. The first physical anthropology curator at what is now the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in the US, Ales Urchlica, actually rejected a sculpture by them which showed the Negroid of Menton, since he was afraid people would imply descent from Black Africans as a common ancestor. And so this was later replaced by a white man of Spain instead. And Russo actually, ironically, himself did not believe that all modern races were based on a common ancestor, but rather were similar in evolution nowadays due to their lifestyles and evolved through different ape-like ancestors. So now I want to move on to perhaps the most influential reconstruction and the one I would juxtapose most clearly with the first reconstruction I showed you from Leningrad. And this is the kind of epitome of the American school of reconstruction. And we'll see just how influential to this day this school is, despite further developments in scientific reconstruction. So the first curator of vertebrate paleontology and later the president of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, Henry Osborn collaborated with his colleague at Columbia University, J.H. McGregor, to create a set of evolutionary busts for the newly created Hall of the Age of Man. And this was really the first dedicated museum space, especially in a large and well-visited museum, where they displayed evolution visually and clearly to the masses. And Osborn himself was a staunch eugenicist, and he did not believe in human phylogeny from apes, actually. He did believe we shared a common ancestor, but he believed that human ancestors were more human than ape-like, rather than evolving from ape-like to human-like. He also rejected the theory that humans came out of Africa, proposing the Asian origin instead. And so that's why the discovery of Pithecanthropus was very convenient for him, because it showed that the oldest species hitherto known to them was actually from Asia. And despite discovery of an older species of Australopithecus africanus in 1924, Osborn maintained Pithecanthropus as the oldest missing link in his display, even doubling down in a catalog in 1925 that the three busts were descended from each other and we descended from them. So I want to show you just how this would have been displayed. On the left here, we see the three busts that he would have displayed. On the left, we see Pithecanthropus as the most primitive in evolution, then Neanderthal man, and then Cro-Magnon man, who is Homo sapiens. And we see while they are distinct from each other and shows the kind of evolutionary movement, we see that there is also a thorough line between all of them. And this was on purpose. Osborn really wanted McGregor to make it as obvious as possible to any audience that came that these were direct descendants of each other, despite that not being true. Of course, we know there was branching evolution, and they knew that at the time. And the artist McGregor had even challenged his display method, arguing that it erroneously implied non-branching evolution. And this display would have been displayed with the kind of diagram we see on the right here. This is an illustration of the diagram just so you can read it more easily, but we have evidence that this exact diagram was in the gallery, and it shows the kind of evolution from the lowest races of man to your Anglo-Europeans, essentially. And while it doesn't really explicitly show that, it goes from like African to Aboriginals, et cetera, the kind of hierarchy in the tree, if one were to look at it quickly, absolutely suggests that, and it shows that we are not actually part of the same species. We simply diverged into different races and evolved differently. And they also heavily embellish their reconstruction. So MacGregor was a pioneer of the American school as opposed to Gerasimov's Russian school. And even though he was very much a champion of scientific veracity, showing the soft tissue depth and everything, they openly changed the facial features to adapt to local taste and perhaps to make it more comfortable for the viewers who were not immediately ready to accept the theory of evolution, but needed something familiar to latch onto. As if you remember from the second slide I showed you, the nuclear family of Pithecanthropus would have looked very familiar to the visitors. So, for example, they added facial hair to Neanderthal man in the middle and to suit contemporary taste, and Cro-Magnon man also looks remarkably modern with groomed hair and a beard. The busts are still salient today, despite it almost being 100 years old. And when you Google Java man or Pithecanthropus erectus, that's the image here of by MacGregor is still the image that comes up. Museum anthropologist Charlotte Porter even said that more Americans derive knowledge from these displays than any single source. And we have to remember that this display coincided with the infamous Scopes monkey trial in the US, in which a Texan school teacher was tried for teaching evolution in school, which was controversial at the time. So this was very hotly contested. And so we see the kind of adaptations made by museum curators opting instead of just showing the fossil records to really deliver a message about evolution, a sort of political message. And so I want to take you now to the present day when reconstructions of Pithecanthropus still exist. And it has changed quite dramatically, but perhaps not in the way that you would think. This is the most recent reconstruction of Pithecanthropus or Java man, and she is now known as Java woman. So in the years since, the fossils have been hotly contested in terms of repatriation debates by Indonesia and the Netherlands. The Netherlands have held on to the fossils and is now displayed in the Naturalis Museum in Leiden, in the Netherlands. And they commissioned famed reconstruction artists, brothers Adri and Alphonse Kennis, to make the newest reconstruction based on the kind of cutting edge scientific methods available. And Adri and Alphonse Kennis' work can be seen everywhere in Western Europe and in the US. They're known to have these kinds of very expressive, heavily embellished reconstructions. So they're not just figures that are kind of standing in space to be seen. They're supposed to be interactive. They're supposed to be engaging, exciting to look at. However, I want you to just take a look at this for a second, and we see the kind of racial tropes emerging again. So the figure, to give you a little bit of context, was launched in 2019. It's displayed in a black dark room on its own. Essentially, a small diagram by the door shows the kind of evolution into Homo sapiens from the earliest fossils discovered, but that's kind of the only contextual information we get. We see this, we see the original fossils in a kind of treasure-like box room, and then we see a video about Dubois' discovery. So the entire display of this Natural History Museum, instead of teaching you about evolution, teaches you about Dubois and Java man and the Dutch colonial endeavor in collecting it, despite Java man not being the only Homo erectus fossil. As of now, many more fossils have been discovered. They really only focus on this one. And we see a very coquettish, seductive kind of woman. I would argue that in the kind of art historical argument that she's not just nude, she's in fact naked. You're allowed to walk around her in the round. She looks at you with her finger in her mouth, and she's holding a little shell, which was discovered later in the same area. They don't know what the shell was for, but it's really used as a little accessory for her. And oddly enough, the description on the website says, quote, "She meets your gaze with a shy smile, prompting thoughts of your own distant ancestor." So this kind of strange, coquettish figure is certainly highly sexualized, and it reminded me especially of the famous Hottentot Venus, or Sartje Bartman, which was her real name, an African woman who had been kidnapped from Africa by the Dutch authority and displayed in Europe in the past. And this is a kind of racialized gawking that I believe is reproduced through this reconstruction. And the Kenneth brothers, to follow the trend of what we have seen, has said they embellish all their reconstructions, usually inspired by extant tribal cultures. They said that tribal peoples were essentially alien to us being, perhaps you would say, Western Europeans, but also that we would look equally alien to them. But of course, this dynamic is not equitable. We are not being displayed in their museums, attended internationally, and set as the kind of scientific standard. So we see the kind of conflation between tribal peoples and evolutionary figures, prehistoric hominids. And we see that by adding things such as tattoos, hairstyles, poses, markings, clothing, things that they took randomly, essentially from tribal anthropological images, they reproduce this kind of false equivalence between tribal peoples and a lower state of evolution. So I argue that this reconstruction really doesn't serve to teach, as we would think visual paleoanthropological reconstructions do, but rather the gallery serves to emphasize the colonial extraction, which foregrounds this discovery and compounds on the visual legacy of Pithecanthropus's reconstructions being embellished heavily to promote an agenda, in this case, to prompt reflections of your own ancestry. And so to close, I want to show you the reconstructions which are in Indonesia and at the museum, which is at the site of the discovery, which is the Sangiran Museum and Early Man site. And we see even more difference in reconstructions. So the reconstructions in the museum feature large-scale dioramas showing cooking, hunting, parenting, and social groups. And the figures are extremely human-like, as we can see here, save for extra hair and ape-like faces. And in the entrance of the museum on the right, we see a giant bust of Java Man as well. Perhaps you can think of it as reminiscent of McGregor's busts that were displayed in the American Museum of Natural History. And we see the kind of influences from the past. And in this case, it appears that scientific veracity is even less considered. The museum doesn't take pains to really show the kind of process of churning a fossil into reconstruction, but rather they simply present familiar, identifiable scenes based on stereotypical caveman imagery. So they're engaging in what we would imagine a caveman would do: hunting, gathering, living in a little circle around a fire. And however, these reconstructions still reproduce the kind of visual tropes that we've seen in the past, whether knowingly or not. For example, Gabriel von Max's nuclear family that we saw in one of the first slides. And of course, I said McGregor's bust. And this follows in the tradition of Indonesian museums being highly visual and often relies only on diorama displays for easy digesting. And I would actually argue that perhaps this kind of familiar display of what Pithecanthropus was is actually not necessarily to educate people about the fossil, but an appeal from the Indonesian government to identify these fossils as their ancestors, which would justify repatriation from the Netherlands, as the Netherlands had repeatedly stated and argued that the fossils are not technically cultural property that should be reconstructed. They're just scientific specimens that have no cultural value. And so I believe that this is the Indonesian government's attempt to change this narrative. So that's essentially it for me. Today, I've taken you through 2 centuries of reconstructions of this very controversial and paradigm-shifting fossil, and show you through these visual reconstructions just what goes into a visual reconstruction, especially for public display, how they are not simply going from fossil to reconstruction, but rather is an amalgamation of the kind of what I've said are gratuitous details of race, socioeconomic status, gender, culture, and most importantly, colonialism.